Ilan, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your first name. Correct me if I've got it wrong.
That's
but you
pretty
are
good.
the chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at Victoria. You have a BA from Hebrew University and a PhD from the University of California studying financial crises. After that, you worked at the University of Hawaii before coming to New Zealand. And you've done quite a bit of consulting work with organisations such as the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, and other international organisations. So we're very grateful and welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Yes, kia ora, everyone. Indeed, I'm the chair in the Te Awhio Nukurangi, which is the chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at Te Heranga Waka, which is Victoria University of Wellington. Nothing that I say here represents the views of anyone else but myself. You can hear me and you can see my slides?
I can't see you. Give me a moment, I'll bring you up on screen.
How are we with the slides?
Okay, I think we can see you now.
Okay, and my slides. I mean, seeing me is not the aim. Slides. Yeah? We good?
Way you go.
Okay. So what I want to talk a little bit, and well, that was what I was asked to talk about, is the economics impact of climate change in Aotearoa. I will start with noting that typically when we talk about climate change, we talk about the increase in the average temperature and sea level rise. But in a sense, what we're doing when we're focusing on that is we're looking for our keys under the streetlight instead of looking for where they actually are, where we should be able to find them. And what I'm trying to argue here is the main cost of climate change is not a change in the average temperatures, and it's not sea level rise. These are easier to measure. These are easier to understand. We can nowadays with CGI, we can easily generate, a picture of Wellington Harbor with another meter of sea level or something like that. So they are very sort of visual, but that's not where the big impacts that we should be concerned about. And Abba in the talk before me just briefly or not briefly actually, she spent the second half of her talk about extreme weather events, and I think this is where we need to focus on. And when I talk about extreme weather events, I'm talking about things like droughts, storms, heat waves, and floods. Okay, so what I want to start with is a little demonstration on how we can think about the cost of extreme weather events, the climate change component of extreme weather events, because extreme weather events have always happened. The main argument we're trying to make is not that extreme weather events are something new, but rather that they are more frequent and more intense than they used to be. Now, if we look at this graph, and I promise this is the only graph in this talk, you've seen plenty of graphs from Abba's talk earlier. So when we think of precipitation, well, that's basically moisture coming from the sky, then we know that the curve is shifting, and there's plenty of climate modeling that shows that, but the basic mechanism is actually quite simple. We don't need a climate model for it. The oceans are warming. We have a lot of evidence on that, not modeling evidence, but actually observational evidence. The ocean is warming. When the ocean is warmer, there's more evaporation, there's more moisture in the air, and therefore more precipitation. So the mechanism is one we've sort of learned in early years in primary school. There's nothing very sophisticated about it. There are other mechanisms that potentially can change the trajectory of precipitation, but that's the basic one. So what we see is that the curve is shifting. The curve is shifting from, well, I'm not sure because I'm colorblind, but let's guess that it's from the blue line to the orange line. And the curve is shifting to the right. Okay. Now, if we think of, say, an event like the Auckland floods or or Cyclone Gabrielle, that event is somewhere, some dot on that orange line. Okay. Now, you can argue that that event became more intense because of climate change. That's basically the horizontal distance between that dot for the Auckland flood, and the equivalent dot on the blue line, that the event became more intense because of climate change. Or you can argue that the event became more likely because of climate change. So, and that's the vertical shift in the curve from that dot downward to the blue line. So what I'm trying to argue is that saying that an event is becoming more frequent or more intense is actually saying the same thing. It's saying that the curve is shifting. Okay, the curve of precipitation is shifting. So looking at frequency or looking at the intensity of the changing frequency or the changing intensity of events is basically looking at the same coin from the two different sides. Okay, so in a paper I recently did together with Rebecca, who is at the Reserve Bank, we tried to look at globally the climate change part of extreme weather, the climate change part of extreme weather events, and especially to evaluate the cost of that. Okay, so what we took is we took a lot of scientific data that was collected, trying to establish that. To go back here, trying to establish that vertical shift in the horizontal shift in the curve, and we matched that with a lot of extreme weather events and a lot of data on the cost of extreme weather events globally. This is a global attempt, and then we combined all this data together to reach some insights. But before we talk about some insights, let's talk about what we find in terms of the changing frequency of extreme weather events. So what is happening to the fraction of attributable risk? So the likelihood of extreme weather events globally. This is again global. This is not for Aotearoa. So heat waves are becoming much more frequent. So the figure there's 0.77 means that heat waves are becoming 77% more likely because of climate change. Floods are becoming more likely, but not by as much, but maybe by 20%. Droughts and wildfires are significantly more likely because of climate change. And not very surprisingly, because of climate change, cold events are becoming less likely globally. Okay. Again, the distribution might be different in different places, so that does not necessarily mean that in Aotearoa cold events are becoming less likely or storms are becoming more likely by 60%. This is the global picture. We need more research on what is happening specifically in our part of the planet, and that's Abba frequently mentioned in her talk that we don't actually have the modeling that allows us to do that very precisely yet. Okay, but we do know we get the global picture. Now, when you look at the global picture, what does that mean in terms of how much are we already paying in terms of the climate change part of extreme weather events? Okay, so you can see that this is a graph that shows you percent of global GDP, how much we are spending per year, or how much we've spent in the last 20 years for damages associated with the climate change part of extreme weather events. So roughly speaking, about half of the currently half the cost of extreme weather events globally is because of climate change. Okay, and when we sort of try to nail that down with a number, because for most of us, percent of global GDP is not really a meaningful number. The number is $143 billion. Okay, that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. Maybe one comparator here, useful comparator, I think, is how much are we pledging to pay globally for adaptation to impacts of climate change. And we have promised the world, in part of the United Nations negotiations on climate change, we have promised $100 billion per year for climate change adaptation and mitigation, with currently about 10% of that is going to climate change adaptation, so about $10 billion. So we are already paying $143 billion, and we're trying to plug that hole with an investment of $10 billion a year. So clearly something is off in our scale, and we are vastly underestimating the current costs of climate change. This is not about the future at all. This is just analysis of existing data and the past. Okay, so you could ask then, okay, why not do the same kind of analysis for us, for New Zealand? We can actually, we have extreme weather events, we have costs associated with it. Sorry, did someone say something? I'm happy to stop for questions if anyone has any questions. But you can ask, okay, why should we do the same kind of, why are you showing us the global picture? We don't really care about the global picture. We only care about what's going on in New Zealand. We did do this kind of analysis for New Zealand, but it's subject to two very strong caveats, and that's why I didn't really want to show you the data. This is the paper if you're interested. One problem is the only information we have in New Zealand about the cost of extreme weather events comes from the Insurance Council. So the Insurance Council collects the data from the private insurers, so the IAGs and the Viros, and they provide the Insurance Council, which is basically the lobbying arm of the insurance industry. They give them all the insurers give them data on how much they paid for each weather event. Okay, so this is the only data we have from New Zealand. If you wanted to know how much those extreme weather events are costing New Zealand more broadly, so for example, through things that are uninsured, through damage to uninsured assets, to costs that the government is incurring that has to pay for various things, for emergency services, for example, or for clearing the land, or for the public insurer costs, the EQC, all of that data is not available. So we don't know. We have no idea. So if you want to know how much if right now we don't know how much tropical cyclone Gabrielle will cost, but even 3 years from now, we wouldn't know how much it did cost because we're not collecting that data. The only data we have is from the Insurance Council. So this gives us a very, very partial picture. Some events, most of the cost is not insured. Okay, so if we look at the recent floods in Hawke's Bay, for example, a lot of the damages for roads and bridges and electricity systems and so forth, none of it is insured. Definitely not insured by the private sector. So this is not part of this kind of data. Okay, so that's one problem. We only have data on insured losses, and we don't have data on uninsured losses and other types of losses. The other issue is if you look at the paper that I just mentioned that tries to quantify the cost of extreme weather events in New Zealand, it looked at the data from this period, so from 2007 to 2017. And you can easily see that what we have experienced in that period is significantly lower than what we've seen in the last 5 years. So the graph you see goes only up to 2021. 2022, we just got the numbers for 2022. It's slightly above 2021. So it's a bit above 350 million New Zealand dollars. That's for 2022. 2023, of course, we have no idea, but already we passed the $350 million with the events that we had in Auckland and the Hawke's Bay. So in the Tairāwhiti. So we clearly we're experiencing in the last 7 years actually a confluence of events that is much more costly than what we have experienced before. Okay, all the modeling suggests that this is not bad luck, that this is climate change, but clearly there's something unusual going on, and that something unusual that's going on is underestimated in the climate change modeling typically. Okay. Okay, so what are the main areas from an economic perspective? What are the main areas of concern for us? Okay, now here I'm building on a recent. A lot of from what goes on from now on. Will build on a recent report by the Treasury, which was the first ever attempt to quantify the economic and financial costs of climate change. It came out just last week, just before the long weekend. As for some reason they issued it on Thursday afternoon, just before everyone left for the holiday. Not exactly sure why the timing, but anyway, their first ever attempt to quantify economic and financial risk costs of climate change in Aotearoa. Maybe the reason that they issued it just before the weekend was because actually they didn't quantify that much. Okay, they weren't able to quantify that much. Okay, but what we do know, exports are a big issue. So our exports, roughly speaking, 20% of our exports is tourism, 20% is dairy, 10% is meat, and 10% is wood products. All of these are subject to climate change risks. So typically when we talk about climate change, we talk about two types of risk. The physical risk, and that's the risk from extreme weather events, the damage from extreme weather events, and transition risk, that's the risk because we have to change our energy systems. We have to stop emitting. We've publicly and internationally committed to stopping emitting greenhouse gases. So by 2050, we're supposed to be net zero in carbon dioxide, and by 2070 or 2080, we're supposed to be net zero for all other greenhouse gases. So we have committed to transitioning our energy system, and that entails risks. Okay, so for example, with tourism, the main risk is the transition risk, because globally everyone is doing this transition at different speeds, but everyone is doing this transition. That means that global aviation is going to become significantly more expensive if indeed that transition happens. And that of course means that's a risk for us, because we are such a long distance tourism destination. Okay, it's likely that long distance tourism destinations will be harmed a lot more than short distance tourist destinations. Okay, so we have a very significant transition risk. The dairy and meat sectors, which account together for about 30% of our exports, are both subject to both physical risks. So physical risks associated specifically with droughts and floods, and Abba talked about the increasing risk of both droughts and floods in the various parts of New Zealand. So somewhat unhelpfully, the regions with the most risk for droughts are also the regions where dairy is most intense. Okay, so this is the Waikato and Canterbury. So somewhat regrettably, there's a sort of an almost perfect alignment with where we are going to have more drought and where most of our cows are. Okay, so we have a very significant physical risk. There is also transition risk, because globally the consumption of dairy and meat has to go down if we are transitioning. Dairy and meat are both relatively greenhouse gas intense in terms of their production, and we see more and more use of alternatives. And the more we use alternatives, of course, that's easier for the transition. It's also more difficult for our exporting sector. Okay, so these are other risks, and of course, with wood and wood products, there is a physical risk, and that's the risk of droughts and wildfires. So, for example, our plan for the future, we have a future plan for mitigation, which involves a lot of planting of new trees. Most of that trees, the region that is most likely to experience a lot of planting of new trees is also unhelpfully the region that's heating the most and where drought and wildfire risk is increasing the most, and that's Central Otago. So again, we seem to have a sort of a misalignment here in terms of where the physical risk is. But of course, forestry also presents a transition opportunity, because it's forest captures greenhouse gases, and specifically carbon dioxide. So the more forest we plant, we are also able to absorb some of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that also involves financial benefits because there are permits involved with that. Okay, so there are credits you can buy by planting forest, and credits you can get by planting forest, meaning income for those who are planting forest. So there's also a transition opportunity here. Many other countries want to plant forests but don't have the suitable land for it. We do have some land available for it. Okay, that's in terms of exports. Another concern, one which I think is going to receive a lot more attention soon, and that is the issue of the changing distribution of extreme weather events, and therefore the changes in the insurance markets. Insurers, private insurers, are in the business of insuring unlikely risks. Once a risk becomes more likely, they are no longer interested in insuring it because it's a loss. It's a loss for them. Insurers are always around for a year. Okay, all of you, some of you own a house. If we look at national statistics, then 2/3 of you own a house. You buy insurance. Your insurance is only good for 1 year. Whether your insurer will renew your insurance contract is 1 year is something you don't know, and you have no power about. Once your house becomes more likely to be subject to an extreme weather event, the insurer is no longer going to be interested in insuring it. And this is built on work that was done a couple of years ago. It looks at 4 markets, well, for big markets: Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin, and looks at when we should we expect to observe insurance retreat given flood risk. Okay, and you see that actually this is not too far into the future. This is subject to very significant modeling uncertainty, because ultimately a lot of times insurance retreat is driven by extreme weather events. So suddenly there is an extreme weather event. The insurer realizes that the risk is higher than what they thought it was, and then they retreat. A lot of times, at least in the case of us here in Aotearoa, that insurance retreat is triggered by international reinsurers. So the events in January and February, the floods in Auckland and Hawke's Bay, were the first time in which reinsurers are paying for an extreme weather event in New Zealand. Up to now, reinsurers only paid for earthquake risk in New Zealand. So after the Christchurch earthquakes and also after the Kaikoura earthquakes. So up to now, reinsurers, those are the big insurance companies that insure our insurers, they thought that the risk in New Zealand is only one of earthquakes. And now they realize it's also extreme weather. They're going to now charge the insurance companies a lot more for insuring our weather. And the insurance companies are going to turn around and stop insuring some of our properties because the risk is too high. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is actually this figure is too optimistic, because I think some of this partial retreat is going to be triggered in the next 12 months when insurance contracts start to be renewed after the events in January and February in Auckland and Hawke's Bay. Another area of concern is that the cost of transition. So we need to transition our energy systems, and transitioning the energy system is going to involve significant spending on significant investment in infrastructure, in electricity generation. We need a lot more electricity. We need change our transport system completely to electrify all of our transport system. We need to change our food systems. All of that involves significant investment. It's not unaffordable, but it is a significant investment. And when we are thinking about that investment, we think either we borrow, so we borrow from our grandkids and we pay for it that way, or we need to cut somewhere else. We need to either increase our tax load or cut our spending somewhere else. Relatively speaking, the New Zealand government is not running a very a budget where there's a lot of sort of fat to be cut. So I'm not sure where that cutting is going to be, and we already have deficiencies in terms of our spending on education and health. So that's another area of concern. Another area of concern is the sort of the spatial distribution of these problems. So if we think of transition, so yes, transition is going to cost a lot, but it's not going to cost a lot equally across the country. So some countries are going to experience a lot more costs associated with the transition than others. There's a clear inequities here, and we need to think about how do we make sure that those inequities are addressed. Okay, right now we don't have the mechanisms to do that. So we don't have the mechanism to support these areas that are more sensitive to those transition costs than others. We don't have any mechanism to do that at all. Okay. Another concern, the cost of adaptation. So we will need to adapt to climate change, and we don't know what the costs are. We do know that they will involve some costs. We don't really have a climate change plan, even though we have a Climate Change Adaptation Act. That act is rather vague and doesn't really tell us much about what we should be spending about, how we should be spending it, and how much we should be spending, or how much we need to be spending. So there's very little we know. Just to give you an example, one type of adaptation is managed retreat. So we've heard a lot of calls after the Auckland floods from various places where homeowners said, you know what, I don't want to go back into this house. It's unsafe. I've been flooded 3 times in the past 10 years, and please buy me out, and I will go somewhere else. That's what we call managed retreat. This is what we should maybe call post-disaster managed retreat. We've done that in the case of Christchurch after the Christchurch earthquakes with the residential red zone. We've also done that in somewhat less successfully in Matata and in a few other places. But what is the cost of managed retreat? We have no idea. We do know it will cost us a lot of money. We don't know how much because we don't know what we will pay for it. So how much are we going to help those homeowners retreat from their locations? We could say, it's their problem. They chose to buy a house wherever that is, and it's their problem. We could take the opposite view, which is what we did in the case of Matata, for example, and that fully compensate everyone for whatever for all the costs associated with moving away from the risk. Okay, and where we land on that sort of range between nothing to everything to full compensation, we don't know. So we have no idea what the costs are going to be. We also know that there are other well-being and equity considerations associated with managed retreat. I can talk a lot about managed retreat, a lot more than this, and I'm not going to, but there's a lot of well-being and equity considerations that we will also need to be thinking about, because this is not an equal opportunity menace. It will hit some populations much harder than others, and we've already seen that in the case of the Auckland and Hawke's Bay floods. Another area of concern is our main way to deal with the reduction of emissions. This is the transition is the emission trading system that we have. So we've started an emission trading system a long time ago. We were actually one of the very first places in the world to start an emission trading system back 15 years ago. During most of that period, the cost of emissions, the price of emission trading permits was so low that actually the program was rather meaningless. But in the past year and a half, the price went up a lot. up to $90. So anyone who cares about climate change saw that as a very good sign, which meant that we are actually starting to get serious about reducing our emissions. But then sort of disappointingly, since the end of last year, the prices have gone down a lot. So those permits are now much cheaper than they were 3-4 months ago, which means that we're doing a lot less mitigation than we should be doing. Okay, the reasons why those prices went down are has to do with the accounting and some changes of the rules the government made. But whichever way you look at it, this is a bad sign for us, because we need that price to be high if we actually serious about reducing our emissions. Another area of concern for us, I think, is that our plan to get to net zero by 2050 is to buy a lot of international permits from abroad. So our argument seems to be that we are unable to cut our own emissions, so we'll just buy emissions reductions from other countries. So basically pay other countries to reduce their emissions more than they are already doing. Okay, and if we pay them to do more, then that's supposed to be a credit for us, and therefore we can get to net zero. There's sort of two issues with that. One is that when we buy international emissions, the question is, where do we buy them? And the prices vary a lot. Okay, so if we buy trustworthy emissions, so if we are serious about climate change, we should only buy permits that are not issued by Nigerian princesses, but by credible entities, and those are very expensive. Okay, so if we buy at those prices, so for example, if we buy at the price that nowadays we think permits will be priced in 2030 in advanced economies where there is a lot of checks and verifications, then the amount of money that will cost us will be billions every year. So very expensive. But on the other hand, if we buy emission trading permits from, as I say, from shady sellers, we can make it a lot cheaper, but then of course we're just cheating ourselves on the world. We're not really achieving emissions reduction. Okay. The other problem is that we're not the only country who is assuming that we will be able to buy emissions abroad. There's a lot of other countries whose plan is explicitly not to reduce emissions, but buy them from another country. So we have a lot of buyers and very, very few, if any, sellers. Actually, there's not a single country who plans to reduce their emissions more than they committed, and therefore can sell their emissions. So we have a lot of sellers and a lot of buyers and no sellers. When there's a lot of buyers and no sellers, the price is just going to go up and up and up and up. So the prices we think we will be buying those permits as are unrealistic. Very last slide, I believe. There's a lot of concerns about what is happening internationally, and I think that is actually the biggest economic cost to us here in Aotearoa. The biggest economic cost of climate change is going to be what's happening in the rest of the world for us. And that's something that Treasury in its report largely ignored. Okay, so Treasury focused in its report largely domestically, but I think what's happening internationally is much more important, even from our own narrow lens of the economic costs to us. So climate change is projected to lead to significant migration pressures elsewhere. Of course, it's going to increase migration pressures in the South Pacific. That's less of a concern from a cost perspective because there are not that many people there, but there are a lot more people in Bangladesh, for example. So, you know, we've forecasted about 100 million people in Bangladesh are living in areas that are untenable with significant sea level rise and increasing storminess. So 100 million people is no longer a number which the world knows how to deal with. We've seen that after the droughts in the Middle East and the Arab Spring and the collapse of Syria. We've seen how the Europe was challenged dealing with 2 to 3 million refugees. And that led to various cascades of impacts. And, this migration of refugees into Europe led to right-wing shifts in many countries. It led to Brexit. It led to, I think, a lot of economic pain in several countries in Europe, not associated directly with the migrations, but with the political changes they generated. So Brexit, for example, was very costly for the UK, and the UK is going to continue paying for it for quite some time. And that started basically because of this cascade of migrations. Internationally, those pressures are going to lead to various cascades of impacts, which are also going to have ripple effects for us here in New Zealand. And specifically, I think I'm also thinking of civil strife in various locations around the world. Okay, and that civil strife is going to lead to pressures for us. We've seen how the war in Ukraine, which is not directly related to climate change at all, but it led to food shortages that are similar to what climate change is going to cause, or actually already caused. If you remember, the Arab Spring started because of a large increase in wheat prices because of droughts and wildfires in Russia and the Ukraine. That was back in 2008. So that kind of pressure builds into, for example, for us, much higher prices for food, and we've seen that. We've actually been experiencing that in the past year.